I think it's very timely to discuss the open question, what is terrorism? Um, the New Zealand attack is opening up a lot of talking points, useful talking points, and it's sad it's taken something like this to do that. But let's just start with that question, what is terrorism? Well, Wikipedia has an article which is basically entitled, they've been doing this for years, list of terrorist attacks in a given year, and they do it month by month. So if we look at March 2019, so far this month, the New Zealand attack is actually the deadliest attack anywhere in the world. However, it stands out because it's the only attack in New Zealand. And naturally, because New Zealand just doesn't have a reputation as a particularly dangerous country, that stands out. Now, not surprisingly, the vast majority of other attacks that are listed on this article are in the context of ongoing conflict zones. So the war in Afghanistan, the war in Syria, the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria, the war in Somalia, the vast majority of attacks are in those situations. There's a few others, more less intensity conflicts like the Papua conflict in Indonesia or with Indonesia, the Colombian conflict, which has wound down but certainly isn't over entirely. Um, So if you look at the list, and I'll provide a link on this, the vast majority of those attacks are within the context of ongoing war zones. Therefore, they're not surprising. And that's why the vast majority, unless they're particularly bloody, don't get attention. So just to give an example of that, in the few days since the New Zealand attack, there has been four incidents on that are included in this. And like again, I have to stress that Wikipedia is not without flaws. You know, it's user made, so people gather information that they get in news sources and put it there. But since the New Zealand attack on the 15th of March, 2 days ago, there has been four terrorist incidents around the world. Syria, ISIS carried out a suicide bombing at Al Baghouz, where the ongoing conflict is going on there to drive ISIS out of their stronghold. Six killed, plus three of the attackers. Also in Syria, three more killed the following day um, in a shooting. Now, this is by no means all the violence in Syria. This is just specific bombings, shootings, and so on. That's not going to include, for example, rocket attacks, methods of conventional warfare, which are probably responsible for the bulk of deaths in Syria. A bombing the same day in Kabul, one killed, one injured. Another bombing that day in also in Afghanistan, four killed. So that gives you an idea. Other major attacks this month include, let me just scroll through this list. This is a very grim list. On the 10th, a shooting in Balamurgab, Afghanistan, killed 20 and wounded 10. That was by the Taliban, or suspected to be by the Taliban. And then further back on the scrolling through the list, a mortar attack in Kabul on the 7th of March killed 11. Afghanistan remains a very dangerous country. Um, Scrolling back, on the 3rd of March, Hama Governorate in Syria, 27 killed in a shooting, plus the five attackers, by a group called Ansar al Tawhid. That was in Hama Governorate. So that gives you an idea of the sort of situation regarding global terrorism. The vast majority of attacks that are considered terrorist are within the context of ongoing armed conflicts. But I want to be branch out a little bit here about contentions around terrorism, and I want to start with a point. Unfortunately, some people are already promoting and spreading a lie, and the lie is that the New Zealand attack isn't being called terrorist. And I've been seeing these memes from Muslims and from outright Islamists who are basically saying, oh, because the victims were Muslim, it isn't being called terrorist. One big problem, though, it is. The New Zealand government, every media source that I've seen, every mainstream media source, um, they've all called it a terrorist incident because it is politically motivated violence. Now, I've heard that it may not be prosecuted as such because apparently New Zealand's got quite a lenient justice system, and apparently the government feels they're more likely to get a longer term imprisonment if they charge this guy with murder. There's always a possibility of extradition opening up. I don't know if Australia is going to make any overtures for extradition or not, but so they're calling it a terrorist attack, but they may prosecute it as mass murder, which will no doubt provoke some controversy. But anyway, what is terrorism? Well, that's important to just dispel that myth. It has been called a terrorist attack. It's important because when people are saying it's not being called a terrorist attack, they're trying to sow into a victimhood narrative that, oh, look, the racist West doesn't care about Muslim victims, except that, there's been condolences and outrage from around the world. So that simply isn't true. On the question of terrorism, it's a very contentious issue because when people perceive that one type of violence is seen as not as serious as another, it's going to provoke anger. But I don't think that just because something isn't called a terrorist attack doesn't mean that people see it as any less evil. So let's look at certain incidents and let's look at, are they called terrorists or not? Let's look at the mass shootings in the United States. One of the main contentions there is, oh, why is it not called terrorist when it's a white man doing it? I think certainly there's cases there that should be referred to as terrorism because they're politically driven violence. But the thing about mass shootings in America is many of them are not necessarily seeking some sort of wider political agenda. A lot of those mass shootings come about from family disputes, from embittered boyfriends who have had a row with their girlfriend and they want to take it out on their workplace or their school, or a school for that matter. Maybe the shooter has suffered bullying. That was a factor in the Columbine case. Um, Workplace shootings are very common in the States. Certainly, all the mass shootings this year, from what I've gathered, have been workplace shootings. In fact, there was even an acronym for this in the 90s, Going Postal, because embittered postal workers were carrying out mass shootings. So a lot of those spree shootings are not necessarily politically driven, i.e., they're not seeking some sort of white supremacist utopia. They're not seeking a caliphate. They're not trying to overthrow the government. They're just um, twisted people who are taking out their anger at a workplace or on their family in a particular way. Now, that's not to say that there isn't examples of violence that absolutely should be called terrorism, and maybe that isn't always the case. So, for example, I would call the racist attack on the black church in Charleston definitely a terrorist attack, a white supremacist terrorist attack, because the killer specifically was targeting black people, Dylan Roof. So that absolutely should be considered a terrorist attack. The Oklahoma City bombing was considered a terrorist incident because it was absolutely politically driven. It was supposed revenge by Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirators against the Clinton government for the Waco siege. That's considered an act of terrorism because it was politically driven violence. It's very important that this is understood, that this is how terrorism is understood. I mean, there's that old phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Now, that's been used less in recent years because I think most people find it rather insulting to victims of terrorism. There's no freedom when people are blowing up marketplaces and slaughtering civilians as opposed to military targets, i.e., conventional war. I should say at this point, I'm talking purely about revolutionary terrorism or radical terrorism as opposed to state terrorism because there's a whole other dynamic of state terrorism, which I'll get into. But On the subject of radical terrorism, extremist terrorism, that is terrorism that is motivated from an ideological agenda. There are plenty of examples, and I think the reason why some acts of violence are not called terrorism is simply because they don't have an obvious political agenda. So when people say, "Oh, it's only because he's white," I don't think that's so much the case. I can see why people perceive that because many of the mass shootings in America are by white men. That's just a fact. Now, in the cases where there is explicit far right tendencies involved, I think it should be classed as terrorism because there is a political agenda there, which is specifically trying to stoke terror to stir up a race war. That's definitely terrorism. But if a white shooter is killing white people, it's more likely to be a workplace dispute or he's being bullied by colleagues or something. I mean, we had the last mass shooting in Britain, the West Cumbria shootings of 2010. That wasn't called a terrorist incident. Why not? Because the perpetrator, Derek Bird, was thought to have had an ongoing grievance with fellow taxi drivers. There were mixed reports going on. Some of them stated that he had been bullied by the people he targeted. Um, that was an act of mass violence. He gunned down 12 people. Some of them he knew, some of them were random people. Why is it not called terrorism? It wasn't called terrorist because Derek Bird didn't leave any sort of manifesto against the government. He didn't leave any sort of white supremacist diatribe. His victims, as far as I know, were all white. Um, he wasn't opposing any sort of government policy. He wasn't opposing British foreign policy or anything like that. It was very much a localized situation. That's why it wasn't called terrorism. And it doesn't make it any less awful. If 12 people die in an Islamist attack versus 12 people dying in a spree shooting, both, in my view, are just as evil, but they are in a different context. And this is what people need to understand. Now, Islamist attacks, like the string of attacks we've seen in Europe, Paris, Nice, Berlin, Barcelona, Brussels, London, Manchester, these attacks are called terrorist because it's a very specific aim by Islamist terrorists to try and spread their caliphate. So there's a very specific ideology there. In some cases, for supposed revenge against military intervention in Muslim lands. But the point is, they're politically driven. Therefore, it's terrorism. And I think people need to understand this when they ask the question, oh, why is this not being called terrorist? Well, look at the context of the particular attack you're referring to. Was it a spree killing whereby the perpetrator had some sort of localized grievance, or was it for a supposed exterior motive? I think that is very important to understand. In Britain, we've had a long history of terrorism. We had the IRA's mainland campaign, and there is unnerving signs that that may be coming back. At this point, it's in the form of non-lethal parcels, but because at Glasgow University recently, parcels were found by a group calling itself the IRA. Now, this is not the traditional IRA. This is a group that call itself the IRA, but most sources are calling the new IRA. As it stands, they are small, non-lethal devices, but they could well escalate that, and it's all, I suspect, connected to the Brexit Irish question. So that's certainly not a good development. But the IRA campaign was considered terrorist, probably not in Ireland, but in mainland Britain, because it was aimed at civilians. Throughout the 70s and the 80s. I mean, one thing I will say about that, the mainland only really started caring about Northern Ireland, unfortunately, when the IRA took their campaign to the mainland. I mean, people in Northern Ireland have been suffering for 5 years before that mainland campaign began in 1974. And there'd been atrocities going on in Ulster for 5 years. It's only when that mainland campaign began that the rest of Britain really started taking an interest, and I must admit, I find that unfortunate. It's only when the attack in Birmingham occurred, with 21 innocents killed, that people really took notice. But Northern Ireland had seen plenty of atrocities on a similar scale, like the Ballykelly nightclub bombing. I believe 18 people were killed. The Le Mans restaurant attack. Um, there's countless atrocities in Ulster on both sides, but the majority were at the hands of Republican paramilitaries. Anyway, they were classed as terrorists because there was a very specific ideological political motive involved, and they were aimed at civilians. Okay, a lot of them were aimed at soldiers and security services, but a lot of civilians died, and that must never be forgotten. Um, Now, state terrorism. This is a very, very controversial issue because it gets into geopolitical disputes and what is state terrorism versus what is a government, um, using self-defense. Actually, New Zealand provides an example for this. 1985, when the French government had agents carry out a bombing on the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour, killing one person, causing significant damage. That was classed as state terrorism. Actually, France is a country that has a lot to answer for. As recently as 1961, well into the 20th century, dozens of Algerian protesters were gunned down on the streets of Paris. 1961, we're talking. This is not 1861, 1961. Um, so France has a very, very murky history in that regard, far worse than Britain, I would say. I mean, with Britain, an example of state terrorism could be Bloody Sunday, but that is our worst example within the United Kingdom. That is in recent years. Um, State terrorism often is when one state actor is fighting another. For example, Israel and Palestine. The question of state terrorism is often leveled at Israel. Now, I happen to believe that Israel has a right to defend itself, without wanting to get into that very complex and very contentious subject. There are nevertheless examples where IDF soldiers cross a line, and that can be considered a sort of form of state terrorism, I guess. What Russia has done in Chechnya can be considered state terrorism. Wherever you have a major government power responsible for civilian deaths, it could be called state terrorism. What Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, um, what Russia is doing in Syria, for that matter, and there's many examples of this. The West is very far from immune, just in case anyone thinks I'm being biased. So state terrorism is a whole different dimension because then that's actually involving governments. And governments, of course, will say they're doing it for national security, whereas radical terrorist groups will say they're doing it to overthrow a government, to insert some sort of warped white supremacy, to insert some sort of warped caliphate. Um, so terrorism is by nature a very contentious issue, but as a base definition, I think politically driven violence. I mean, I guess the difference you would argue with governments, and this certainly does not apply to all governments, but governments are bound by such international laws as the Geneva Convention. The difference is terrorist groups have no moral code of conduct. They have no sort of attempt whatsoever to minimize civilian casualties. Very few of them do. Governments, at least some governments, have certain how can I put this? They have certain barometers where they know that if we kill civilians, we need to investigate this. We need to have some sort of mechanisms in place to try and mitigate that as much as possible. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but the point is, when will you ever see the likes of ISIS investigating civilian deaths? They won't, because that's the whole point. They're deliberately targeting and brutalizing civilians. Governments, I hate to say the term collateral damage. I think it's an odious term because if British or Russian or French or Syrian warplanes are slaughtering civilians, then it's no comfort to the victims to say, "Oh well, we try to avoid." So, I mean, Syria is not even a good example. I believe that the Assad regime, is just a brutal totalitarian regime. But if we're looking at a country like Britain, France, Russia, they will claim that they're trying to minimize civilian casualties, and then there's a war of words over this. But the point is, I mean, I know with Britain and America, when civilian casualties are reported, they will have investigations into it. Now, you can say it's a whitewash, you can say that can't be trusted, but the point is, terrorist groups don't care. Terrorist groups don't have any moral red lines. They don't have any red lines of saying, well, we're going to try and minimize civilian casualties. Governments should do that. Governments should seriously take as many efforts as they can to minimize civilian casualties because someone's killed, like I say, by a French or British warplane. It's no good saying, "Oh, we're very sorry, we didn't mean to do that." It's not going to decrease the pain or the anger, understandably. So I, as a British person, can't blame a Yemeni citizen for hating Britain because they know that we are arming Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen, and that's where things get very complex. Anyway, maybe I'm getting too in depth with this, but what is terrorism? As a base definition, it's politically driven violence. And there is, like I say, extremist ideological terrorism and there is state terrorism. And there is differences there. I'm not saying moral differences, I'm saying differences in how that is defined. But I will say that governments, certainly not all governments, but I would say the British government and the American government, they have blood on their hands without question, but they do not deliberately target civilians, at least not in recent years. It's not a case that they intervene in Syria and say, okay, we're going to kill civilians. The point about intervention in Syria was the Assad regime and ISIS were the targets. And yes, civilians died because it's a war zone. But that is a difference, and I think it's important to understand that difference when people talk about state terrorism. Anyway, I don't regard that intervention at all as state terrorism. That was intervention precisely to stop state terrorism from the Assad regime. Anyway, don't want to make this too long, and inevitably it's going to be a very controversial video. I expect I'll ruffle a lot of feathers with this one, but so be it. That's how I interpret it.